I'll start with Dusan's questions, which are important because there have been lots and lots of changes in BFO, but they're not changes in the content of BFO itself, which has remained very stable for 20 years, but rather in the surrounding support system that we've been building. And so now we have a place where you can find what is current in BFO. And that particular link contains also links to what used to be current in BFO and to multiple other resources. We don't yet have the same kind of resource for IOF because IOF is still building the architecture for how it's going to document releases and so forth over time. But at some stage, there will be, we hope, be a similar place where you can go to find out what is current in IOF. All right, now, what's the difference? These are Dusan's questions, remember. What's the difference between... Yeah. But still, it's a good starting point. So what's the difference between BFO and IOF? So BFO is what we call a top-level ontology. That means it's an ontology which starts at the very top with very general terms like object, process, and so forth. And those terms then provide what you need to start writing definitions of more specific terms like factory or weak or person. So BFO is very small. It's used by hundreds of ontology project groups around the world, some 700 in the public domain that we've been able to track. Not all of those users use it properly. And at some stage, we will find a way of correcting that by creating TikTok videos showing how BFO is to be used properly. That is not a joke, unfortunately. And then we have these people building domain ontologies. As we will see as we go along, it's a good idea if people build domain ontologies in suites of ontologies which communicate with each other in such a way that you don't have one group building an ontology for sustainment of military materiel, for instance, and another group creating an ontology of military materiel, and they don't talk to each other. So the strategy that we developed is a strategy for creating suites of domain ontologies with BFO at the very top. And now, what we've been doing now for years is creating examples of how BFO is used in different domains, like the industry domain, which we're talking about at this meeting. Now, it started in around 2002, 2003, when I became involved with the groups of people around the world who were trying to make use of the new data which was unleashed by the Human Genome Project. The people were building repositories of omics data in genomics, in proteomics, and all the dozens of other omics disciplines. And they were all collecting these data with different labels and different descriptions. And I, as a lucky chance, was involved with the leaders of the main ontology, which was trying to create some kind of harmony or consistency across all of these different repositories. And they were, at the same time, attracting copycats who wanted to build their ontologies for their repository. And these would be ontologies not of genomics or proteomics, but they would be ontologies of things like disease or population or pediatrics. And so chaos was threatening. Now the chaos came about not because we had too many databases being built inconsistently across the world, but because we had now too many ontologies which were being built inconsistently around the world, all trying to copy the success of the gene ontology, which is still the biggest and most successful ontology in the world. Now, I decided that I would create a framework whereby we could understand what ontologies that were being built now would indeed be consistent in its approach with the gene ontology, so that you could use the ontologies together with the gene ontology, but B, have certain kinds of characteristics which would advance the possibility of having equal success in those other areas to the successes which had been achieved by the gene ontology. And in working out from first principles what the best way to do those things would be, BFO was created. The BFO is, if you like, a reverse engineered version of the very top level of the gene ontology. And so a very general top level. So the gene ontology consists of three ontologies. One ontology is the ontology of cell components, where the gene is found. Another is the ontology of molecular functions, what the genes or the proteins do at that level. And the third ontology was an ontology of biological processes, which includes everything from cell division to sexual mating behavior. I guess there is no other kind of mating behavior. So the BFO is based on three top-level terms measured by this standard: objects, cell components; functions, what molecules do; processes, what happens biologically when those molecules do their thing. And so this is illustrated in this picture here. You can see I'm only up to slide 7, and I've already spent 7 minutes. So with 200 slides, and that's because you keep interrupting me. So the three top levels of BFO are continuant, which means all of those things which continue, and occurrent, which means those things which happen, processes. And then there are two kinds of continuance, and this is the nearest we get to rocket science: dependent continuance, attributes in general, functions, qualities, dispositions, and so forth; and independent continuance, which means objects, planets, molecules, and everything in between. And then you can arrange the ontologies according to how they fit under these three categories, which are the basic categories of BFO, as we will see. All right, so then we added further layers, further possibilities as new ontologies were not merely built, but received into what was now called the OBO Foundry, which was very much like the IO Foundry, because the IO Foundry was built to be like the OBO Foundry. And then we added an ontology not for proteins or diseases, but for the experiments which are performed to identify the functions of proteins and so forth. And that's OB, which is the most, of all the ontologies in the OBO Foundry, OB is the most ambitious and the most logically coherent of the ontologies. It was built by people who cared a lot about logic. And the very first work I did in the area of industrial manufacturing was on additive manufacturing. And I created, with people who know about additive manufacturing, an ontology of additive manufacturing based on OB. So I recommend that you look at OB when you're thinking about manufacturing processes. All right, then we realized that we had nowhere in BFO to deal with information artifacts. So remember, we'd been focusing on things like proteins and diseases. Information is a quite different thing, but that's the product of experiments. Experiments produce information. So we built the information artifact ontology. That was the only major change in BFO. We had to find a place for information, and we only had objects, attributes, and processes. Attributes meaning attributes of objects. We needed a place for information, and so that was BFO 1.1, I think. Then we had BFO 2, which was the new version, which was created when OWL 2 appeared. So no changes in BFO. And now we have BFO 2020, which, apart from a few labeling changes and the dropping of one or two terms which had problems, is the same as BFO 2.0. So we've only had 3 versions in the course of 20 years history. All right, and we became an ISO standard. That was something which was brought about by the Army intelligence, because they had been using ideas from the Oboe Foundry as the basis for a reorganization of the way they approach data. And they realized that if they were going to be successful across the DoD, they needed to have an ISO standard. And so they made BFO into an ISO standard. And now we are recognized as a baseline standard for the DoD and the IC, and we're reaching a similar situation in the DHS where we have real successes. All right, so that's what it says here. So this is BFO 2020, which is what we have today. And there is work going on behind the scenes to create BFO 2025 or whatever we call it. But the official version is at the GitHub link that I gave to you earlier. So let's talk a little bit about the IOF. It was born in 2016. Hedy Carré was a postdoc working in Buffalo on ontologies. To my shame, I didn't talk to him very much, but almost on the day he was leaving, he came to my office and he said, Barry, why don't we start an industrial ontologies foundry? And I realized that this man was a very important person. And he is now program manager for AI in the European Innovation Council. So other people recognize that he's a very important person. He still plays in the background of IOF, but he's not an active member of our community, although who knows what might happen if we develop our European connections. So Europe is in some ways advanced beyond what we are aiming here in the US. And I can talk about that later on if people are interested. So Hedy came to me, I said, this is a fantastic idea, what do we do next? And he said, talk to Dimitris. Dimitris is a bourgeois de Lausanne, Greek. I won't say that he's a very important visionary when it comes to ontology use within the modern industrial world, Industry 4.3 or whatever it is. Now he's connected with the university in Lausanne, in Oslo, but he still has an emeritus position in the EPFL, which is the French part of Switzerland engineering school. And then there is CERN, who played a very important role because he made, this is why we're in this building, he made IOF somehow be under that state anyway, be under the umbrella of NIST. And he was responsible for other important things. In particular, this fight. So the question, when we founded IOF, with BFO at the top, the question arose, why should it be BFO? And so some people said, well, we should work out which is better of the possible candidates. And we had 3 candidates who came forward, and we spent months with all kinds of voting systems, and BFO won the vote. Now, the reason why BFO won the vote, I believe, and I've written a paper about this, is because BFO is more than just an ontology. It's a support system. So it's a product service system. It provides services, documentation, expert consultation, most of it free because we're crazy, constant updates to applications, recordings of applications of BFO and of its related ontologies in different areas, including industry, and many other aspects that people find useful when it comes to ontology building. Dolce produces academic papers, but you don't really find any service support for your ontology work with Dolce. All right, so now we have, as I say, more than 700 users of BFO, and we have an increasing number of users. So one of the main reasons for this is because of the idea of retrieval augmented generation, whereby many people are beginning to see that the RAG-based procedures in AI work better when they are built on the basis of a well-grounded ontology. And that means that we have more people interested in finding out what a well-grounded ontology would look like. And that brings them willy-nilly to BFO. And this is why I gave you the handout. So we have been, we meaning me and my collaborator, who is an AI entrepreneur, biologist, MD, mathematician, philosopher, journalist, father of 5 children, and so forth. He is an extremely clever person, maybe too clever for his own boots, who came to me in desperation, having tried for 15 years to build a chatbot for organizations like banks. And he had come to the conclusion that it's impossible. And so he wanted to find out. And he came to me, I have no idea why, well, apart from the fact that we knew each other, to find out why it is that it's so hard to build chatbots. And that's what the book is about. And it's just been released in a 2nd edition, and that's what the flyer is about. So we now have several BFO-based engineering ontologies. This is one of the first. It's a maintenance ontology, I believe, and you can see that Hedi is one of the authors here. I think we have made great progress in cleaning up the world of maintenance ontology over time. These are just some examples of other BFO-based engineering ontologies. I get about 1 a week from my Google alert. And so this is BFO playing the role of top-level ontology. It's serving as a starting point for people who want to build domain ontologies in their specific area. Now, it's not doing all the work. It's not bringing these people together to form consistent suites of ontologies, which are linked to their neighbors within the suite. So that's why IOF is needed. IOF creates that ingredient whereby the domain ontologies, which are, if they do things properly, well structured because they're based on BFO, they also need to be future-proofed by being linked to the ontologies which are being built in the surrounding neighborhoods. That's the only way that you can have a chance of being useful in the next 5, 10 years, if your ontology is being built in tandem with the ontologies being built by your neighbors. And so this is the standard. It costs 0 Swiss francs. This screen is about the standard number 21838-1, which is a statement of the requirements for being a top-level ontology. BFO is 21838-2. It's also free. It's free because it's used to build other standards. And ISO IEC 21838-2 shows that BFO satisfies the requirements stated in -1. So what are the requirements for being a top-level ontology? Well, there have to be textual definitions of all the terms. There has to be an OWL2 axiomatization, and there has to be a first-order logic axiomatization. And this is quite difficult, and it's difficult not least because we require a consistency proof for what may be a set of 300 first-order logic axioms. And then the final, and this is the real killer, it has to be maximally general. In other words, it has to cover everything. That's hard. It's hard to work out how you would prove that you satisfy that requirement. And the way we decided was we gave a list of 12 domains, including things like processes, objects, activities of people, domains which are widespread, which cover across many populations, many periods in human history. And we say that in order to prove that you satisfy the requirement of being maximally general, you have to show how you would handle data using your ontology belonging to that particular heading. There are 12 headings. All right. Now, in all of this, we did not include mathematics under the heading. We did not include physics under the heading. That's because we were interested primarily in areas where people collect empirical data. People do not collect empirical data when they're doing mathematics. Now we have decided, because we want to move out into the world of physics, that we need to have some way of dealing with mathematical entities. Not as part of BFO, because we're still constrained to areas where we have empirical data. But in order to do physics, you need mathematics. And so we need a way of understanding ontologically the relationship between mathematics and BFO. And this is a very early, written by my AI colleague, and a very early approach to that particular set of problems. The second edition of the book contains a new chapter on physics, which is about physical systems. It's a contribution to the ontology of systems engineering and systems physics, if you like. All right, so Todd, who is Todd here? I mean, in some virtual sense of here? Okay, so somebody ought to tell him that I'm beginning to talk about it. Todd raised some questions about what are called principles of realism. So BFO is well known to be an ontology which attempts to satisfy a realist approach. And now, there are two worlds in the ontology kingdom. One world is the US, and the three worlds. One world is the US, one world is Europe, which means Italy, and the third world, which we won't talk about, is England, which is really bad. So in America, basically, people would turn, first of all, to BFO if they want to choose an ontology. In Europe, they would turn to Italy and to Dolce, because Dolce is Italian, and the Europeans don't like to use things which they think are tainted by America. And so BFO is a realist ontology. Dolce is a domain ontology for linguistic and conceptual engineering. If you see an ontology with a name like that, you should run in the opposite direction, because it means you're building an ontology of what goes on in people's heads or when they speak. And if you want an ontology about factories or about molecules or about chemical processes, you don't want to know what goes on inside people's heads. You want to know what goes on inside the world. And then you want to find good ways of describing it. That's what BFO tries to do. And it turns out that when you move at this general level, then you can apply, it's so general, you can apply it at multiple levels of granularity. You can apply it to molecules, and you can apply it to planets and galaxies, for all we know. And you can apply it on the basis of different perspectives. You can look at the process in the world. You can look at the objects in the world. You can look at the time sequences in the world. BFO can cater in this minimalistic, highly general way to all of these different perspectives. Dolce can do that too, but Dolce it does it from a conceptualist direction, and BFO tries to do it from what we call a realist direction. And so Dolce looks to the concepts in the world, and the problem is, of course, that people in Italy have concepts which are different from people in Peru or Tibet. And that's why we don't look at concepts, we look at the molecules, or at the people, or at the buildings, or the manufacturing processes. And then we find that there are categories, or types, or universals in each of those areas. There are types of people, there are types of building, there are types of processes, and these types have relations. And BFO works at the level of very general types, which we call categories. We try and work out the relations at that level, and then those relations are inherited at lower levels. So this is the top level. We have continuants, which are things which continue, and we define that in a very limited way. When you're at this level, it's very hard to formulate definitions, because to formulate definitions, you need to say what kind of thing you're defining, and then you need to know what the next kind up is. And here we're at the very top. So we have independent continuants like people, planets, tables, molecules, and we have what we here are calling specifically dependent continuants, which means things like shape, color, temperature, and so forth. So qualities, in other words. Also roles, we'll come to that. And then we have processes. And all of these are universals, and at the bottom you can see instances. So one of those dots there on the very left is me, because I'm an independent continuum. Which means I continue to exist and I don't depend on anything else. In contrast to my headache, which depends on me. So it's a specifically dependent continuum. We'll see what specific is doing here in a minute. All right, now, of course, we might be wrong when we build an ontology. So realism doesn't say that every ontology is somehow connected to its own reality. What it says is that we should strive to have ontologies which reflect reality. And now the question is, how do instances play a role? So we're not really interested in universals. We're interested in universals because they have instances, such as you and me. We are both instances of universal, namely the universal human being. So one of the issues is, do all universals have instances? And Dusan is in the room because Dusan is the vehicle for producing what I think is a good answer to this question. So when we are designing a new kind of gadget, there are no instances, but we want to talk about objects of that kind already in the design phase. That's what engineering design is all about. How does BFO then manage to work with engineers who are involved in the design phase when there are no universals? For Aristotle, every universal always has instances. He doesn't leave any room for evolution or for production design processes. But we have to allow the possibility that a design might bring into existence something like a universal, even though there are no instances of that universal until a much later phase in the engineering process. And so I am now canvassing for the idea that we introduce a new term, or anyway, a new definition of a term which we've been using sloppily for a long time, namely the term type. Types are a special kind of universal, namely they are universals which can exist proactively. In other words, they can exist before there are any instances. And so I'm going to put type into a little pocket I've created for my own purposes called BFO plus, which is where I'll put terms which are, for one reason or another, not going to be part of BFO, at least not yet. All right, now we come to a second set of questions which come from Claude. So I haven't talked about general. Actually, I should have type read or proofread the question. We have specifically dependent continuants in BFO. We also have generically dependent continuants, which I think is what Claude is getting at here. A generically dependent continuant is an attribute which can migrate. An example would be a PDF file. PDF file is a generically dependent continuant because you can send your PDF file to a friend by email and delete it from your computer. The PDF file still exists because it's migrated to another bearer. You can't do that with your headache. You can't do it with your height or your weight or your shape, but you can do it with a generically dependent continuant. And information entities are the main example of generically dependent continuants. And now Claude wants to know, are there other kinds of dependent continuants? And he created this chart, which I'm using as a starting point now for understanding questions like this. So First of all, Claude distinguishes, wants to know, I guess this is the modality that we're speaking in now, are there human-made entities which fall under the BFO universal material entity alongside natural entities? In other words, are there two kinds of material entities? We don't have that in BFO. Someone might build an ontology which is lower down, which makes that distinction. That would be fine. But I don't think the distinction is well grounded, because some natural entities may be remade artificially. So we may have a molecule which is a natural entity which cures cancer, which we find in a certain plant. It's natural, but then we make many copies of this molecule in a factory. It's the same molecule. And so there is no cut, no divide between man-made and natural entities in BFO or near BFO. All right, the next, well, actually, this is, so Claude has cancer under natural material entities. The problem with cancer, and you have to remember that BFO was born because I and my colleagues were thinking about the questions like, what is, ontologically speaking, cancer or a cancer? That's important. So in one meaning, cancer means a tumor, which is an object. And this is cancer as a count noun, where you can say 2 cancers or 4 cancers, because what you mean is 2 tumors or 4 tumors. And then cancer might mean disease, which is a disposition. I'll come to what dispositions are later on, but roughly speaking, it means potentials, tendencies, real physical possibilities. And this is also a count noun. You can have 2 diseases or 17 diseases. And then there is the cancer in your body, which is replicating itself very rapidly. That is not a count noun. It means the whole cancer in your body, and then it's a mass noun, like sugar or luggage or information. In France, you can talk about informations in French, but you can't talk about informations in English because it's a mass noun, like water or any substance noun. So how do we deal with mass nouns? It turns out that when you try and deal ontologically with mass nouns, you make mistakes, or the people who use your ontology make mistakes. Now, I believe, and this is out of more than 20 years of experience now, standing in podiums like this, that ontology, good ontology which is good for the world, has a legislative function. In other words, we're going to force people to move along a certain direction. They don't care. Who cares about whether you use mass nouns or count nouns in a specific context? But we care because we know things. And so we should tell them in a loud voice, even with an English accent, a loud, convinced voice. You should never use mass nouns when building an ontology. And you just make mistakes if you do that. All right. Now, water, the same kind of problem arises for water. Water is in its main uses as a mass noun. So you could order 6 waters from the supermarket by which you mean 6 different kinds of water. But then you should say 6 kinds of water, or bottles of 6 different kinds. You shouldn't say 6 waters. It sounds bad in English. And then there are 4 meanings of the word water. In ordinary English parlance, you could mean a kind of water, you could mean some water, you could mean all the water in the universe, you could mean exactly 1 pint of water. And here too, we see the problems that you get when you use a mass noun. You should use portion of water, which is a count noun. And something similar arises for stone. These are all Claude's examples. So when you say use stone, you might mean this stone, or you might mean the substance stone, or you might mean all the stone in the universe. But if you just say stone, you won't have clarity because it's mass noun. And the same thing applies to air. So here, an air might mean the aggregate of air molecules. That's probably not what it is, but That's what some people mean when they think they're thinking precisely. All right, so again, I've said it 4 times now. When building an ontology, never use mass nouns. If you find mass nouns in an ontology, you should run in the opposite direction. Now, this means that BFO made an architectural error, not because we used mass nouns, but because we ignored an issue that BFO faces when it tries to be applied towards the real physical world. This is why physics becomes important. We have objects, but when we're dealing with liquid, portions of liquid, or with portions of gas, or with portions of plasma, none of those are going to be objects, at least not at ordinary room temperature. So BFO needs to be extended with terms which will cover portions of material which are not objects. And now, interestingly, there is an ontology called the European Materials Modeling Ontology, EMMO, which was created by an Italian, mostly, as part of a European Union project of the European Materials Modeling Council. And it was really good. It was based on BFO. It added to BFO granularity layers to deal with gases, liquids, plasmas. Very, very well architected. I was really impressed. Unfortunately, I didn't take a screenshot. Now, suddenly, behind our backs, because the funding from the European Commission ended, I imagine, they changed the name. It's now called the European, I don't have anything against Europe, but an ontology should not start out with a geographical name. So the European multi-perspectival ontology, I've forgotten what the other M means. And now it's changed completely. The layers, the granularity, the object, the plasma, it's all gone. Now they want to build everything on the basis of quantum physics. They have 11 axioms, which they think give an account of everything which exists, because everything is made of quantum something. So if we build our ontology based on quantum something, we will have everything. It will be a top-level ontology from the bottom up. It's very strange. I won't talk anymore because I'll get angry. All right. Now, Claude says, where do philosophical concepts go? I wish I had an hour for the next bit. So, when I started working in ontology, I was working with medical people. And there is a very important medical ontology called SNOMED, the Systematized Nomenclature for Medicine. Still very important worldwide, lots of different languages, language versions, very, very well defended by governments. They changed it a bit to calm me down, because I had a multi-year campaign. It's crap, I said. Mainly at the top. At the bottom, there's just too much, but at the top, it's crap. What is at the top? The word concept. Everything in the medical world is a concept, they said. So influenza is a concept. That's nonsense. So there is a concept, influenza, but that's a concept. But influenza is not the concept of influenza. Influenza is something that goes on in reality, not in people's heads. So what's the solution? This applied in other areas. In semantic web, it's full of concept crap. I said, never use the word concept. If you use the word concept, you have to give me $1. That was the idea. And if I use the word concept, I have to give you $100. That was the deal. And I did not use the word concept then. I mentioned it. All right, so that's the deal. So Claude, never use the word concept, then you will be my friend. You will save France. All right, then we have mathematical thingies. geometric shapes, numbers. We're working on the mathematics ontology, and we're working on the physics ontology, on entropy. One of the principal topics running through the whole book is entropy, thermodynamics. That's the AI book, not the BFO book. All right, and then I mentioned this already. So then what other kinds of cases of generically dependent continuance do we have in addition to, well, the two main examples in BFO papers at that time were gene sequences or ribonucleotide sequences, protein sequences, and so on the one hand, and information entities on the other hand. These are generically dependent continuants. We know that gene sequences are patterns, roughly, in your genome, which can be copied multiple times, which is the mark of a generically dependent continuant rather than a specifically dependent continuant. So what other examples? So, and what one of the confusions, which I believe we helped to eliminate from hype about the genome project, one of the confusions is to say that a DNA sequence is an information entity, so that biology now becomes part of computer science. People said that. They say similar things about AI, similarly confuse things. Gene sequences are not information entities, but they are entities, molecular entities, which are such that we can create very, very reliable representations in information entities. So we have a copying process. We have a process of perfect representation in an information entity. But that doesn't, the fact that we have a really good photograph of a person does not mean that a person is a photograph, or that, which is basically the argument they made. We created an ontology of information artifacts which made clear that information artifacts are not made of molecules. And the people working on OB particularly, a group of people which included me, but which included also other BFO creators. Alan Rottenberg is the most important person at this stage in the history. Still today, very important. We created clarity about the relation between gene sequences and information, and that's now built into the way the world of sequence biology functions. All right, now what other patterns are captured in addition to information and gene sequences? That's Claude's question. Well, my answer is games are generically dependent continuants. Laws are generically dependent continuants. So in other words, everything which goes on in Washington evolves or revolves around generically dependent continuants. They're creating them all the time. And they're not just pieces of information. They have powers. And software is software is a mass noun. There are no fines imposed for using software, but you shouldn't really use the word software. You should say piece of software or software tool. And money is a generically dependent continuum. And so the most important frontier areas of BFO research today relate to things like money, transactions, and things like that. Laws also, the state. All right, and so these are features of BFO, and now comes Todd. So now you could send Todd a message. Then he can't defend, otherwise he can't defend himself. So
I'm here.
Todd says, what follows if the realism principle is dropped? So you use BFO, you say all the nice things, but you don't care about reality. We address this problem in a paper, which is all about realism, really. And one of the points we make in this paper is that we already have people using BFO very well who don't care about realism. They don't care about reality. They're like other computer scientists. They like the software architecture that BFO makes possible. So you don't have to believe that you're replicating or representing reality in order to do good work with BFO. But still, BFO enables you to have clarity about distinctions on the side of reality, which other ontological processes are confused about. And so for the purposes of this meeting, I tried to write down what some of those clarifying insights might be. And these are not new. Aristotle already was here, but they are new to many circles of ontology application activity. So the first thing is, Aristotle said, every universal has instances. We have now, after a long and bitter argument with Dusan, come to the conclusion that there are universals which have been created by people and which exist even though they don't have instances yet. And that is a kind of clarification, a useful clarification if you're interested in ontology of engineering design, but also in many other areas, musical composition, dance invention, and many, many areas. In fact, most of the really interesting things in life are generically dependent continuums. So money and laws, but music and poems. All right, and now the second is, it's a very important test for whether you have a universal which you're dealing with. A universal is such that if you instantiate it at any time, a universal is such that if you're an instance of it, but then later cease to be an instance of it, then you will go out of existence. So I'm a human being. If I cease to be a human being, I'm gone. There isn't me anymore. A cat, similarly, if it ceases to be a cat, it will no longer exist. But if you are thinking of things like, and I'll come back to this example later, factories which are open on Sunday, that is not a universal because it doesn't satisfy this test. You can close the factory on Sundays. It would still exist. It wouldn't satisfy the label, but this just means that that label is not the label for a universal. So this is, well, more examples. Dog is a universal by this test. Child is not a universal. When a child ceases to be a child, it doesn't go out of existence. And so every universal has to satisfy both of these conditions, and we think. And now that it might be that we need to work on that with regard to engineering design again, because you could have a really good engineering design created by Ford or somewhere, and they invest millions. The design is fantastic, but then there is a nuclear war and they never build a single instance. So we still need to work on the details, but generally speaking, we have this rule that every universal must at some time have an instance. Yes? So you're not really allowed to speak at this point, but a lot of philosophical time has been wasted by questions like that. So who the hell cares? You're hanging out with the wrong people if you worry about unicorns.
Well, no, of course, but let's get a little more technical. For example, there are technically designs done by Jules Verne or Da Vinci that would never become.
Yeah, I just said we need to think about designs which never become realized. So I'm on the same side as you where it matters.
How technical does it have to be recognized as a design?
It's an edge problem. We can never get perfect precision. All right, so we have this rule. We put the word prospectively in here to keep you happy. All right, other principles. Number 4. So Plato has this phrase, when you try and cut up reality, and we're trying to cut up reality now, there are joints, there are places where we really do have divisions. And it may be that we later learn that there are no divisions, or we may later learn that what we thought was a twofold division is in fact a threefold division. So ontology is part of science in the sense that it's a fallibilistic activity. We might make mistakes, but if we don't make any mistakes, then we can assume that where we find joints in reality, that means there are joints in reality, which means that there are real distinctions between cats and dogs, or I better not say males and females, between children and adults even though we don't know where to draw the line, we still accept that there are real distinctions between children, or we should still accept that there are real distinctions between children and adults. We're trying to capture those real distinctions. And now the real key is, and this is something else which Aristotle saw, the real key is that when we do track down those real distinctions, we end up with hierarchies in the mathematical sense. And that means a tree is a hierarchy. If every node in the tree has exactly one parent, except the very top node, which has 0 parents. So Aristotle influenced Linnaeus, who showed that this is true of the world of living things. You get problems at the level of bacteria, we have since discovered, but for macroorganisms, the hierarchical principle, and I believe for all the areas where BFO would be being used, leaving aside bacteriology perhaps and virology, we're going to be dealing with trees. All right. So I've said this before, but I'll say it again. In order to be successful, you have to build your ontology as part of a hub. If you are not already part of a hub and you've already built some ontology, you should find the nearest relevant hub and then make your craft your ontology or recraft your ontology or replace your ontology with an ontology that fits with that hub. That's what IOF is for. And then the second key to success is to choose a well-grounded top-level ontology, and at the moment, BFO is the only game in town. Now, another rule, which it's very, very cheap to avoid to follow this rule. Every term in an ontology should be a singular noun or noun phrase. So, drug administration or headache. I don't really need to give examples, but the main classification of medical information, which is called, I've forgotten, has the very nice axiom, socialism is our political systems. Now that is evidence that there was a mistake made because nobody told them about singular nouns. And the reason why singular nouns work is because terms in ontologies represent universals, and you want to have one term for each universal. Therefore, you need a noun or a noun phrase. No verbs, no sentences. So here we have the qualities. So qualities is a processes, I think, and then processes is a temporal. Temporal is a base ontology. So there's something going wrong here. And then BFO, that kind of thing doesn't go wrong. So we know what continuants are, we know what occurrents are. You are a continuant, your life is an occurrent. We have depends on specifically, and temperature depends on the bearer. You can't get someone else's temperature. So influenza may be a generically dependent continuant, although we need to think about it. We need to think about infectious diseases very carefully when we're dealing with things like that. So we have a really good infectious disease ontology. All right, so now we come to government and law and things like that. So I have 6 minutes. Qualities, we know, they're easy to understand, and they are such that if they exist, then they exist at all times. So there aren't two modes of existence in the way in which there are two modes of existence of something like lecturer. So I am a lecturer because I am now realizing my role as a lecturer, but I'm not always realizing my role as a lecturer. And sometimes I sleep, and I may never realize my role as a lecturer. I may just be paid money to be a lecturer in a university or somewhere. So roles are different from qualities. Roles are not always realized. Qualities are always realized. And dispositions are like roles, they're not always realized. So we have two kinds of specifically dependent continuants. And I'm going to leave the next 4 minutes to John to go through some yellow slides. I'll just say, so we have qualities and we have realizable dependent continuants. Realizable dependent continuants are roles on the one hand, which are assigned by some social act typically, and dispositions which are a matter of physics. Okay.
Hello. I didn't realize I'd be up, so I'm here. Yeah, I'm happy to take as long as you'll give me. I do like to talk and I love a stage. So yeah, processes in BFO. I know this has taken up a lot of time and thought on people's parts. So Barry asked me to get up and say a bit about it because I've thought a lot about it myself. So you probably know, or if you don't, I'll remind you, so processes in BFO are not the sorts of things that change. So they don't have qualities. They're not bearers of things like you and me. So I bear a shape right now, a certain shape right now, a different shape right now, a different shape, stuff like that. Gaining and losing these things over time. A very intuitive way of understanding, both philosophically and from a common sense perspective, what change amounts to is a gain or loss of properties of that sort, right? So what is it for something to change? Extended over time, gain or loss of properties. So we're dealing with processes, though. We say they don't gain or lose properties in the same way that you or I might, because, roughly speaking, they have happened already. So they're there. The processes in BFO exist. They're already there. They have the dependent entities that they will always have once they've occurred. So it's not proper. It's actually, incorrect to say that they might gain or lose properties the way I am when I move, because they already have the properties. So because of this, the consequence is an easy step to jump over and say, well, then processes, they aren't really changes, or they aren't really changing, because they don't fall into this gain or loss. Nevertheless, they are changes, we say. So there's kind of the upshot. In a slogan form, processes don't change, but they are changes. So the gain or loss of properties, that happens with processes. Now, of course, you can talk about different aspects of processes or different cuttings or slices of processes as a way of describing differences from one slice of the process to another in a way that might look like change. And we often do this. You could say, John is speaking slowly now, and in this process, he starts speaking more quickly and blah, 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 and he's doing this thing with his mouth and all that good stuff, and it's up and down and up and down and all that. But it's not the process that's changing, it's John, right? I'm changing. I'm participating in a process. I'm participating in something that's extended over time. And what you're doing is you're looking at slices of that process of speaking. And when you're thinking about the changing, you might be inclined to say is the changing of the process, it's actually John's participation or the properties that he's bearing being gained or lost throughout that. Putting this, with a finer philosophical point, sometimes this is described in the literature as not real change. It's more like difference. So difference of one part of a process at one point versus difference of another. So sometimes this is said that's not real change of processes because there's not gain or loss of properties. It's just difference at different times. Much like, you know, if you have a fire poker and it's cold on one side and hot on the other, there's just a difference. There's no real change between the fire poker's ends. You're just looking at one point and you're looking at another. One has a hot property, the other has a cold property. Does that make sense? Whether you agree with it or not, I just want to make sure if that makes sense. Yeah.
Fermentation.
Fermentation? Describe fermentation. It sounds like a process to me. So this is a good example. So say more about the amount of fermentation change. What are you counting?
Well, fermentation needs a kickstart to begin with, right?
Yeah.
So just because they put the ingredients on the table doesn't mean fermentation will start.
Of course.
And fermentation will end when a number of things happen, either temperature or sugar.
Agreed.
But calling the thing a process of fermentation, which is how it's generally discussed by humans, does not fit into your model as clearly as I can see.
I feel like it does. So you have a process of fermentation that has lots of different, you know, accelerators or catalysts or whatnot, ingredients. And a lot of these are material things, portions of material things that bear various qualities. At various times, they bear dispositions and whatnot. They might even bear roles at certain parts, you know, if it's an accelerator. Nevertheless, like those are all qualities, properties born by the material stuff or the independent continuants that are participating in a process of fermentation. Right. So, but I'll help you out, right? Like if the kind of thing that might be troubling to think about when trying to fit in this model is you want to talk about the rate of change or something like that of the fermentation process. So you want to talk someone comes qualitatively about the process itself, rather than like the accelerator or the yeast or whatnot, right? And I'm bringing this up on purpose. It's because it's unintuitive to some extent the way it's modeled. All of that kind of rate change, all of those descriptions that you might be inclined to attribute to the process itself, they all have to be grounded in the material bearers, the independent continuant bearers, gaining or losing themselves, qualities or dispositions or roles or whatnot over time. And so you always have to just fundamentally point there when you're describing the change rather than describe the process itself as bearing some kind of qualitative change. I mean, if I put that even more simply, like a flight can be turbulent. We want to say a flight is turbulent, right? It's the flight. But on our characterization, it's the jostling and whatnot of the things participating in the flight. That's where the turbulence is derived from. And we can, loosely speaking, say the flight is turbulent, but really it's me jostling in my seat, among other things. Does that make sense?
I have a question actually, which was a question for Barry, but you can answer it on no problem.
Best.
That was my original question. So in IOF meetings recently, we discussed about process profile, process characteristic. Am I reading you correctly that actually they don't exist because they are describing SDCs of participants in the process, or do you just shed some light on that process profile, process characteristic? And
Yeah. So what I'm saying should be compatible with process profile, process characteristic, although process characteristic, as I understand, doesn't have like a formal characterization yet, although it's a work in progress. And process profile, though, was introduced to kind of capture the commonalities that we see in processes like regular change, cycles, stuff like that, without having to both say anything about processes themselves having qualities or get into the tizzies that you might get into when you're dealing with Alan trying to talk about, ternary, or trying to get outside the scope of Alan, talk about ternary properties. So without those sorts of resources, process profiles enter the picture as a way to talk about, like, again, these regularities of processes that we see. Again, compatible with everything I've just said about the change, though. I'll note that to my mind, the best, like at least, and correct me if I'm wrong, my best understanding of the utility of process profiles, though, are as they're sort of like to be contrasted with temporal slices that you might take of processes at various times. And process profiles are a way to cut horizontally out of processes that you take interest in. So like the beating of my heart as part of the process. Like I might take interest in the regularity of it existing over time, that kind of cycle. And what I can do is I can take that slice and then take a slice horizontally and think about specific beat here or there or some subset of the beats. And I find a lot of value myself modeling and being able to do that kind of cross-stitching using process profiles versus processes. Although I will say, to your point, the process profile characterization that Barry presented in the literature was initially pitched, and I think can do some of the work of capturing intuitions about like process change here. Although, again, it's not going to be all at the end of the day different from what I've described insofar as the processes themselves don't have properties. They're not gaining or losing properties nonetheless. It's kind of like a refocusing of
questions. If I'm walking 3 miles per hour, is this process characteristic or my SDC, my quality at that point?
What is a process characteristic?
Process profile, or I don't know. I mean, we have that in IOF and /BFO.
Let me have a go. So we've been trying, this is a really hard problem.
I know.
Change. And we've been approached by many people who have begged to give us a vehicle for describing what intuitively are the qualities or properties of processes. And you're one of them, I imagine. And so we've come up with the following solution of convenience. Namely, if you want to build an ontology and you want to describe processes, then we give you an analog of quality for processes. We use the term process characteristic. So a process characteristic is on the page just like an object quality. And that means anything you can say about a process, in principle, can be recorded in your ontology as a process characteristic. So if the process was interrupted, if the process was boring, if the process was repeated, then they're all process characteristics. And you may define a process characteristic for your own purposes in your own ontology, and that will be all legal and BFO conformant. But there is no universal process characteristic. It's merely an abbreviation for something which takes account of what John has just been saying. And we admit that we have come late to this particular circus for reasons which have to do with very powerful philosophical considerations. And we are now working very hard to document what I just said in a way which doesn't sound quite so fishy. And then I need to talk about process profile.
Yeah. So I want to add. Yeah. Well, I want to add. So Barry's talking about us coming late to the game and whatnot. I'm not so sure. We're not linguists. Like I'm not an ontology engineer because I'm interested in like the way people talk. I'm interested in modeling a structure on which I can derive the way people talk. So I totally understand like how what I've just described might sound a little counterintuitive. I don't care because I can derive all the intuitive stuff that you say. And that's what I care about. And I have a common structure that can do that. You can call it what you want. If process gets your heckles up, call it something else. I don't care. I'm not a linguist. So some of this in these conversations I find, and I talk about this a lot of intuitions get mongered. People have an idea of what events are and processes and whatnot. Again, I don't care. I care about the logic. And I can derive what you say.
I'm with you.
Yeah, that's right.
One thing that's unclear to me is how, if a process is changed, how do you point out a particular specifically dependent continuant to say that is the thing that's changing? The color of the rose, for example. Is that possible? What relation would you recommend using?
Can you hear me? So the way you just described, I guess, like you have we have, I mean, you can say this, but like ultimately I think what you're asking about, like, you want something deeper than a process profile, you can give it a name, like you can give it a class name, but if you're talking about like the actual change, Like the
Problem
thing-
is that
yeah.
a process has a participant, but
Yeah.
then it's just a vague, you're pointing at the participant, something about that changed.
Mhm.
And, if you're
Like
talking about,
equality.
running at 6 miles per hour, how do you point at a particular, well, actually, it's a bad example. If you're talking about the color of the rose changing from red to brown,
Mhm,
how do you
mhm.
point at the color of the rose to say that that is the thing that changed in this process profile?
Yeah, well, on the one hand, we have some resources to do this. You can point to the specific instance of quality that's borne by the rose, right? And we do this in that case studies paper, BFO, that was in the Applied Ontology Journal. You can point to that specific quality, and you can say it has like this determinable relationship. So you can talk about like it being a specific like instance of a specific shade and then shifting over to different shades. But you can talk at like a higher level of green or red or whatever color it is and say like at the determinable level, there's still a constancy through the change. But you can also talk about the instance itself taking on different determinate qualities, right? Like, or changing through them, like it's just kind of cycling through that. And that's what we do in the case study paper. So that's like a specific instance of quality at the determinate level that like goes from like green to brown, right? And it's just shifting through the determinants and taking these on. Now, of course, it's specific like instance of brown can't be shared by other instances, right? They're not migratable, but the instance itself can take on different determinate colors.
The question I have is the color changing from, let's say, red to brown, the name of a determinate universal? Is it encoded in the name? Is there some other way to connect that portion of a process to say that the subject of the change is the color of the rose as opposed to the size of the rose?
I see what you're saying. So in the resources with BFO, we have participation. We have the links between the change and the process. But there, we kind of leave open how you model the specifics of the change and how you point to the subjects and objects. But in something like the Common Core, there's like a whole hierarchy and set of relationships that characterize that, like how you would pick out the subject that's changing or being gained or lost.
So I'm going to talk about process profile if I go back to the podium. But I will say now that in the original paper about process profiles, we distinguish various kinds of process profiles. And one kind of process profile is what we call a quality process profile. So you focus, process profile means a sliver in the middle of a process that you focus on or measure or observe, and you focus on color. So there is a process profile of the plant growth and decay process, which takes the plant from being red or green to being brown. And that process, because every process profile is a process, that process of changing color is a part of the larger process of the plant fermenting and rotting. And that's the general principle. So process profiles are kosher processes, but they are parts of larger processes. So the process of his heart beating is a process profile within the much larger profile, which is his life or his history. And the heartbeat process profile is cyclical for the moment, where his life is not cyclical. So when we look at process profiles, we see different kinds of patterns which become combined together to make the whole full process, which is somebody's life. And we have documented this. It was part of BFO 2.0 already. It was removed from BFO 2020 because there are still questions. So where do node process profiles begin? And where do they end? So he has not just a heartbeat cycle, he also has a blood pressure cycle. Is that, if we take those two together, is that one process profile or is it two process profiles? We don't really know where to draw the joint of reality separating mere process profiles from full processes. And for that reason, we deprecated process profile from the official version of BFO, but it still has a BFO number because it was part of BFO 2.0, and it will now, for the moment, be part of BFO plus. So it's probably one of the most popular innovations in the BFO ontology world of all of the things that we've said. Lots of people are using it. We are not yet, as you can tell, we're not quite yet fully in control of how it should probably be used.
100% agree. I also, yeah, just real quick, and then I'll
just want
hop
to
in.
check my understanding. So
Uh-huh.
a manufacturing process can be developed, it can be constructed. And so while it is being constructed, it is undergoing the process of construction and therefore is not yet a process because it's being changed by the process of making it.
Not quite. Tell me more details
Well,
about
like,
this thing
I'm
being constructed.
designing the process of building a car. There's a process that needs to happen to the materials of the car.
Yeah.
But I need to make that process in the first place.
You mean like design the process?
Yeah.
Like you need to set
So
up
the
like a
process of
specification.
designing a process.
Yeah.
Results in changes to the participant in that design process. The participant being the process that will be then used to construct the car.
It sounds like you're saying, all right, I lay down a specification for the manufacturing of a vehicle that will prescribe the way materials will be arranged in certain ways in the future, but they haven't yet been arranged. Like you
So
would
it's not
expect.
a process until
There is a process involved, but what there's ambiguity here. One process you're talking about that is completed in this example is the creation of the blueprint, right? Gone through the design phase. Now what you're doing with the design phase and saying, hey, go forth on the conveyor line, right? Put these things together in a certain way and follow this as a guide. And then there's a different process that goes on. Hopefully, if your company is going to make a profit, a lot of processes that go on according to the specs, and there are processes that are subsequent to that, like sending these things to dealerships and selling them and whatnot that justify your original design. And so different processes going on, all of which can be explained, right? According to what I've just described. Yeah.
okay, that makes sense.
I would say that process is all along. So during the process of designing the process of creating the car, you have participants who are the designers, and maybe they have various test mechanisms and services that they draw on, but it's all processes, and the participants are just who you would think they would be, namely the people involved and things around them that they use. Once they've reached the point of having the design for the process of creating the car, then they have an output. So processes have participants and they have outputs. In this case, the output is a process design. That process design that's an information content entity, but it's also an information content entity with an instruction or a request or a desirability or a requirement component. So it's going to make people do things like a musical score. And so it's not any old information content entity. It's not a description of something. It's an information content entity with a, what's the word? Prescription role. Not role. But
No, but that is that's where we agree, because if you use only prescription, you cannot specify semantic relationships between this design process and
we
its
never
participants.
use only.
I know,
always,
but there is something
always,
else. So there is a process that you are designing. So
yeah, there is a process.
Jim says, is it type or is it ideal instance of future process? That is what you are designing.
So now you're slipping away again. So let's go slowly.
I know, but
so when you design a design process, so hang on, let's get this right. When you design a manufacturing process, so tell me if I'm stating the example wrong. When you design a manufacturing process, what you're actually doing is creating an information content entity. That information content entity is going to serve the purposes of the people who then build the damn car. Do we need to say anything more than that?
How do you represent relationships between participants in that process? Between participants, this process that you are designing.
Which
process that you are designing, manufacturing process
they
you
are
designing.
represented in the information content.
But you don't
describe
represent
them.
participants in that future process. There is not there There is no semantic. You cannot ask, what do I need to make that process?
So
Like
you're,
an agent in Bravo.
Agent, resources, machines, tools, what is output of that process?
so most of those things that are universals which have instances all over the world.
Some of them don't have instance. What you are making doesn't have instance yet.
What you make the, so I'm not sure if it's true that designing the process for manufacturing a car of a certain type comes down in the end to creating that type in the sense that we both agree is possible to happen. But if it is sufficient, then you have your type. If the manufacturing process then is ever unleashed, then you will have instances of that type. But for the moment, you only have the type, if you're lucky.
That's right. I found another mic. Yeah, so like there's a straightforward way to model this. So if you're talking about blueprints and specs, stuff that is designing something that hasn't happened yet, much like in the case of fiction or simulations, there are no instances calling out to the arrangements of types that you anticipate in the future. And you can handle this even within the scope of OWL, just with some basic restrictions. You can create something like a blueprint specification as an information thing, and it's restricted to only types that otherwise would have instances, but a conjunction of them and the relationships that they might bear that exist already in the ontology. So material entities, portions of this or that, all of which can recursively be defined, even if you're referencing something that doesn't exist, all of which can recursively be defined in terms of information just on that recipe. So you never have to talk about instances unless they come into existence as a consequence of the blueprints and types of roles. Yeah. Jim and I just got done writing a paper about this. Yeah. Absolutely, but we can do so at the level of types and like the intersection of types, which is an important distinction. If I'm like creating a specification for Honda SLS or something, I'm like prescribing how I would like an instance to be a witness for the intersection of different types. I'm not talking about any specific instance. There is no instance, but once there is, it's a witness for the intersection. Just like when I'm talking about Harry Potter, a bunch of properties arranged in a certain way, nothing calls out to that. If there is, I'll be surprised in the future, but right now it's just a fictional thing. Yeah.
Why not just consider design as a role for ICEs?
A role for ICs?
Yeah.
I do not understand what you just said. Say it again.
Well, consider design, like, you know, an information content entity doesn't necessarily have to be a design until it's being realized as like a blueprint or so on and so forth. Why not consider it as a role?
I feel like
the design itself.
I feel like you can have designs that aren't ever realized. It seems like a plausible use. You know, people put together specifications.
Well, I'm just saying that in order to avoid what I was talking to telling Barry earlier, that the fact that like, well, we just don't, then you don't have to deal with the ambiguity of how technical does a description of something that doesn't exist need to be in order for it to be a design. I can go on and write books about how biologically dragons get to exist, but I don't have a design of dragons. Sure. Do I?
I mean, so on the one hand, I hear what you're saying, but, and, you know, I acknowledge there might be some value to avoiding the kind of ambiguity, or at least leaning into the ambiguity and getting by, but I'm vehemently opposed to just allowing for that. Like, because specifications, I instead want a recipe for how to add the specification details as you need them, which is what we were doing. I don't want to say, here's a class, and then, you know, fill it in as you want. I want to provide guidance because I want the logical structure to be something that's repeated over and over again. And I think it goes away to answer the question you were raising. How specific? I don't tell you how specific. I'll give you a recipe for creating the specificity, and then the stakeholders will tell me how specific it has to be. I'm not a blueprint designer. Not that blueprint. I'm a recipe designer. But this actually goes back to something I wanted to say when Barry was talking. Oh yeah, I care about that. I care about a recipe. Of course you can. I'm describing what they do. I'm describing the life of engineers. I'm not complicating it. I don't want to get in the way. I'm not getting in the way. That's what I'm doing. I'm not going to, like, for example, say that there's an instance calling out to some design specification. That's not the spec itself. That's some intersection of instances or the types that they have. That would be getting in the way because I'd be making them say something false, and they would agree.
So I'm gonna try. So I'm Alan. I'm working for Boeing.
Cult leader.
I'm an engineer. I'm also a cult leader and trying to socialize the value of ontology within Boeing. And so we were talking yesterday about the Church of Ontology. Anyways, I feel like I'm walking into a minefield here. So bear with me as I start rambling my thoughts. Right. So the notion of a design, right, within manufacturing in aerospace, right, of a design that may never come into being, right? And so I the process of a design, right, the act of engineering, it feels like that is a process. In that act of engineering, there's an output, which is a blueprint or a CAD drawing or something that feels like a information content entity that would then be used if we want to actually realize that product in reality. But that design, right? First I have a thought in my mind, right, of about this thing that I'm going to design, right? And I might put that thought on a piece of paper, right? Now I've externalized that thought into reality for other people to see. I also might put that thought on a piece of paper. I might put it into a CAD, I might put it into a model. I've externalized that thought. So when it comes to engineering design, it all starts with a thought, right? You can't find that thought in my brain, right? Is that thought an instance, right? So do I tie everything from the design? Can I tie it to an instance of a thought? Is that instance of a thought a thing?
Yes.
I don't know.
We want to allow. I mean, we don't often go into the kind of mental representations of consciousness or thoughts or whatnot, but we certainly could. Like, there are mental qualities that are inhering in your brain, the material thing, in certain arrangements, and they can be the sorts of qualities that concretize information that's putatively about stuff in the world. You have an idea, you have like a blueprint, it's a thought, that's material thing carrying information. Some of that information you might want to convey to me, right? Like you're talking in the microphone. You convey it using your vocal cords as reverberation, all these particles with qualities, and they're transmitting it. Ideally, I'll get it.
Yeah, but I want to actually, that instance of a thought of something that I had last night in the shower, I want to actually put that into a database, an RDF, that said, I had this thought yesterday, April 9th at some time, that I thought about this new airplane design. I have a temporal, a timestamp associated with that thought. That thought then matures, right? It's not the same thought. It's matured over time. But I want to capture that maturation of this thought that then became a piece of paper, that then became a CAD, that then became something I give to the manufacturer, that then becomes something, material gets procured, it then gets produced. I want traceability of that all the way through that original thought that I had yesterday.
So yeah, there's information that is common throughout. There's like information that has the same content. Now that content can change in various ways semantically, but and assuming there's some kind of boundaries within, like just like a threshold within which it doesn't change outside of it. It's a completely different thought. You would judge it that way, I would judge it that way. But you can nevertheless like maintain that there's a certain content, a specific content that might undergo this or that change as it matures through the workflow or through a brainstorming session or whatnot.
Sure. But what I want, right, is that as that design matures, right, from the time it happened yesterday to tomorrow and next year and the years follow, what I want is that a log of that change of information as it matures, so that I can ask questions. What happened? I want to do a difference, right? I want to do a difference of design from 2 years in the future to what it is today.
Yeah.
Right. And there's no
This is what I was trying to get to. There's a provenance of choices. Like am I going to use Monte Carlo or Navier-Stokes to analyze something? There's a provenance of choice. And those, you want to track those choices
Correct.
and they may beget processes, like how I'm going to analyze something or how I'm going to test something. Exactly right. I know exactly what you're saying. And I don't see that here because BFOs, as I learned, reinforced today by Barry, it's about physical things that are realized.
It's because it's higher.
Empirical data.
But it's also higher level than this. So provenance is extension. Like we lay groundwork on which provenance would be tracked, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So you see this in Common Core or Common Annotations or Provo, right? And this sort of stuff, and now we have a mapping from Provo into BFO. This sort of stuff you wouldn't properly put in BFO, but it would be extended down through hub and spoke.
Yeah, because what I found, like in engineering workflows, there are activities without entities. Agents have activities.
Yep.
And they may exist as a record, let's say a record in a giant database. That's not really a taggable entity by itself. It doesn't stand alone. Or a thought in your head. It's not an entity. And yet, when we're tracking provenance of decisions, I want to do a reasoning. Why did this guy's design methodology work better than this guy's methodology?
Correct.
And that means every single decision, every attribute of the provenance is important. And so that's why I made that question about Provo and map. I want to stay in the BFO world because ultimately then there are entities at a certain point. Entities do get created and they fit into BFO. But
Absolutely.
The process is what is interesting to me. Yes.
Yeah, and both. I mean, both the information and the processes. All of this can be tracked, and you can extend down from BFO. There's a common framework. It's a common framework which you can do in many groups. I mean, there are several groups that extend in different ways. There's like some people in DMD and IC they use this common annotation standard, which is not exactly the same as Provo, although inspired by it. And folks outside, in the open space often use Provo, which is why we have a mapping to it. But all of this is on board, and we definitely want to recognize the need for tracking both the information as it matures over time, also the processes involved, the processes that might be prescribed or described by that, all within scope.
So I say all this, having thought about it, from a practical standpoint, it's workable. You're able to track that instance of a thought as it matures.
So you can track it because you write it down.
Correct. Right. And then I can, if I want, I can say that, hey, I have an instance of this thing that I put as a named individual of a instance of something that I can now query. Right. So that's not an issue from a practical standpoint and putting it into a database. So philosophically, I don't know.
I think we're violently agreed.
Yes.
There's a space for it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and can I add just one thing? Because I think, so when we have a design and we have a model that has a different life, and I don't want to go to the configuration control, but when you go to the MSN, so there's a completely different life. So when you have the actual object and your model, they can be, there's decorrelation on that, and you need to track that as well. So yes.
Yeah. So you're touching on that there's life cycle management of the information as it matures, right? And so it's not just a physical product that we want to have life cycle of. We want to have life cycle of information artifacts.
I never said that this during design physical artifact exists. Don't put it into my mouth. I never said that. I said that we are designing something which may be a future artifact. And simplifying reasoning about that future artifact is simplified significantly if you make instance of that in your model, instance of that future artifact would be ideal engine. You can run simulation on that engine. You can run Navier-Stokes equations, Monte Carlo simulation with properties, attributes, qualities of that artifact. Answer questions, what is weight of that engine that you are designing?
Non-existent.
But
You're completely allowed to do that. There's no issue.
It does instantiate once.
That's what I'm saying. So I'm not saying that this physical artifact exists today. I'm saying you make model of that artifact as an instance that you can reason in engineering sense, whatever you need to make decision that this is performance and cost-effective solution. And you have many different alternatives that you are going to compare and design and choose best one to go forward. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that this physical artifact exists today. I understand that. I've been engineer for 40 years.
So listen, I understand, and you are in scope of the paper, like we take your view in consideration. But what we don't say is speaking to this kind of, optimized query discussion that you're bringing up right now, but I'll add right here. So you're talking about like the ease of reasoning and whatnot using like a dummy instance or something. You don't actually need that. You can do it at the type level, like we show, like you can write queries, you can optimize your queries for this sort of thing. It's an information extraction question. There are many ways to solve that. You can introduce shackle shapes to kind of modify your graph to do this as well. So what I'm saying is, as a matter of the ontology, it is, I think, theoretically incorrect to say that there is an instance, even a dummy instance, calling out to what the blueprint is supposed to be about, on the one hand, and two, all of the practical motivation that might, inform your judgment about whether it includes such a thing can be done in different ways that don't put falsehoods in the mouths of engineers. And, it's something that was worked out. It's something that we did in practice at APL. When I worked there, we had the same problem. We were often talking about stuff that didn't happen, simulations. We're doing red teaming and cyber stuff. Like, hope this doesn't happen. We hope there's no instance calling out to this simulation, like that's the plan. And so we had to figure out a way to do it. And I'm just saying, like, optimizing queries about this, that's the easy part. The hard part is making sure we don't put falsehoods in the mouths of engineers.
And the hard part is collecting data.
Yeah.
Everybody has workflows to build things. Everybody has workflows to build things, cars, planes, jets, whatever. But very rarely do people write down their thoughts. Do they write down every process? Do they have a grad student sitting next to them, entering into a chronological database, the agent, the entity, whatever, right? And so we talk a lot about fit for purpose, and why I came to this meeting was I want to be able to have that kind of information management querying, right? And I have software that does that in the workflow. It logs and collects stuff, but I need to instantiate it in a way through these ontologies that makes it kosher, that makes it able to be calculated on, and those kinds of things, a history track. So that I was looking at this as a gap until that paper came, and that paper just came out. And I sent the question to Barry, and it was great. It was awesome, So anyway, that's what I'm.
Hey, I'll take compliments. You guys want to give some more? I'll take them.
Hey, I got a question. I want to rewind back to something that Alan said. Sorry. So first, is it the case that the thought that you have that you put to paper is a generically dependent continuant, and that your mind is concretizing and the paper is concretizing? Okay.
Yeah, so that thought, right, is an information content entity. The bearer of that thought is this brain matter that's happening, right? And then I externalize that maybe as sounds and so, right, things that are propagating through air. It's transferable, right? It's copyable. I can also put that on a piece of paper with ink. That information is there,
right?
And the piece of paper is the bearer of that information.
Right. And there's various ways, different words you can use, sentences, modeling tools to express the same.
I could express the same content in different ways by architecting and crafting portions of information in different ways to convey some type of meaning, right? And so I can put into sentences, I can put into a UML diagram, I can use my words. I'm architecting and using portions of information in a particular way to convey meaning to somebody else, whether it be a computer or another human. It also depends on how I architect it, depending on who the audience is, that I want that audience member to gain meaning, right? So
that was a foundation for another question I wanted to ask.
Yep.
More to John or to Barry. is when a GDC changes, can a GDC change? And if it changes, does it produce a different GDC or does the GDC change?
Yeah, so this is a fascinating question, and I don't have full-on like characterized identity conditions for GDCs, but what I do want is to respect the the seemingly strong intuitions that folks have about there being some kind of identity conditions that nevertheless allow for change the way an enduring thing might. I mean, they are independent continuants. I'm sorry, they're not. There are continuants, so the things that endure. So we should have some criteria about which we allow somewhat of like material or whatnot changing while nevertheless persisting in their identity. Where that threshold is the tricky part. Like if I make a change to a Word document, like if I change the to a at the beginning of a sentence, is this new information? That's a hard question. Yeah.
Let me explain how this happened. So there are various feeders into BFO. One of them is Aristotle. Another one is GIS, treatment of space and time and so forth. Another one is a Polish philosopher by the name of, I see. Another important influence was a Polish philosopher by the name of Roman Ingarden, who wrote a book called The Literary Work of Art. And it applies not just to literature, it applies also to newspaper articles or science texts or databases or any kind of information content entity. So he started the life of information content entity ontology. And he had the idea that we have the text, which comes in instances, but it's a text of, let's say, a novel. And the novel is the same. It appears over and over again in printed books. And now, but a novel is more than just a text. When you read a novel, you read about certain fictional characters. Ali, you should leave the room for the next few minutes. You read about fictional characters and you read about their emotions and the places where they go and the wars they get involved in and so on. But now, so we ask, what is the literary work? What is a literary work of art? If we want to do justice to that, we need to take into account what happens when readers read a text, because it's they who concretize the text. Concretize is a technical term used by Palantir. They haven't been reading Ingarden, but they may have been reading BFO. The readers concretize this text, and now in the immediate post-publication phase, they'll concretize it in a sloppy way. There won't be any patterns really, but then gradually people will learn how to read it properly. And what that means is that the concretizations, which are generically dependent continuants, dependent upon the brains of all the readers and on the text, over time, this concretization will have a life. So GDCs can have a life. And if all the readers die and all the copies are destroyed, that GDC will cease to exist. But so long as there are readers with brains who are concretizing the work, that concretization, which is the work for Ingarden. So we're not really interested in the text, we're interested in the text as a description of all of these goings on. And it's that which has the aesthetic value. If you read it badly, you lose the aesthetic value. All right, so that's my contribution. So concretizations are things that can in principle have lives. And I think that works in the engineering case also. The design will evolve. It's the same design, you still initiated it, but it's evolving nonetheless, as it must, because it's then got to overcome the hurdles of physical realization.
Let me slip in another quick question that's on exactly this. Can some GDCs be more generic than others? Like, the book of Harry Potter, it evolved in J.K. Rowling's mind. And as she told it to her children night after night until she wrote it down. So is there a general Harry Potter story kind of a GDC that's somehow related to a more specific incarnation that is then concretized?
Check this out. All right, you've got the information that's being conveyed by Rowling to her kids, and then ultimately is conveyed in books to millions of people worldwide. So now, if you're thinking about like the genericness, what an interesting information content entity that you're using to measure the kind of count right? As opposed to another. So you can describe it that way. You can describe it within the scope of BFO in terms of like genericness. Now, is it like its own class up there on par with GDCs or like constitutive of them? No, but you could construct it, right? You can construct an instance that's about all of these instantiations. You could create instances that are about like information that's about information, right? As a descriptive matter, that's within scope. But we do this oftentimes with blueprints, right? Or processes. We can describe like the domain or the range of like the information relation as it's you know, a subclass, or I'm sorry, information content entity as a subclass of GDCs. They're often in like different extensions of BFO. The range is always entity. It's anything.
Yeah, I think so. The question of maturation of a design, right? So I'm thinking in my mind is that I could have an instance of just design of aircraft, right? And then I could have just an overarching one, and then I'm gonna have a conceptual design that I just thought about yesterday, and I have an instance of that, right? And then I would have another instance today, and another instance, another instance. And then I think I need differences. I think they each need to be an instance so that I can look at the past and see how it's changed. But then the overall instance of a generalization of a design, I could say that this overall generalization design is about, or I don't know if it's vice versa, but this is about to each of the instances that mature over time, I think.
So I think we can extend this to the actual life cycle of aircraft production. So you build an aircraft of a certain mark. I don't know what the technical terms are here. And then you produce Mark II. It's the same underlying framework. Then you produce Mark III. Then by Mark V, you find that you need to make so many changes. All of the aircraft produced so far are instances of aircraft type 1, Mark I, but now you need an aircraft type 2 because you've made so many changes, you're in a different world, you start again, as it were. Now I don't know if that makes sense to say that you do that also prior to production, where you have a design which goes through multiple phases, maybe in different shops, which are more critical on focus on different aspects. You can still recognize that it's the design for the same aircraft, but it's going through phases which are demarcated in ways corresponding to what people now believe about what the production process will look like.
Just as a confirmation for what you said, would you treat for example, an equation of a mathematical equation the same, and its graph? Or, for example, the book series of Tolkien's Lord of the Rings versus the comic books, would you treat them as the same way that you just described? Because technically they are about the same thing. I know you would.
So we have not trodden very far into these domains, but I think you're on.
I would.
I'm leaving the field entirely open.
So yes. Yeah, okay, good.
He says yes.
Can I just comment with respect to Jim's question? Can GDC, IC change, and what happens?
Yes, of course they can. Yeah, we have good examples.
Since GDC, IC may have multiple copies, like you said, books. So if you change one of them, if somebody goes and crosses one word and says both of them exist.
Yeah. So
in practical, let me finish. But in practical world, if example, gentlemen, I don't know your name, sorry. You give example of engineering design. I can decide that I don't want to take this design anymore and just delete all files about the design, and basically this IC ceases to exist. I may create new one. So point if IC changing or ceasing existence is related to how many other artifacts where it is realized exist. If there is more than one, it doesn't.
So if an orchestra,
there is only one, it disappears.
If an orchestra performs Beethoven's 7th Symphony and makes one mistake, one trumpet sound is one. Does that mean it's not a performance of Beethoven's Seventh Symphony? The answer to this question is don't talk about philosophically interesting examples. Talk about examples which are genuinely important for understanding things like engineering production.
But I think that what we're missing in a discussion of engineering and simulation is it's a super duper multi-scale thing. And that we look at it as a workflow from start to end, either ending in something that's going to get built or something that's not going to get built. There's a zillion things: wind tunnel tests, material tests, flight tests, cards, loads. So all of that, and it's never deleted. That's a company asset, because somebody will come back 10 years from now and say, did we have any Mach 7 tests? I used data from 1995. That was super, right? Exactly what I need for hypersonics. So that is what the complexity of engineering. And there was a talk yesterday that, or 2 days ago, said that, well, simulation is not branching. It's these parallel worlds. That's untrue. Design is branching, a zillion branches. There's decisions made at every point. Everybody wants to encapsulate that. And at least today, there is not one simulation of an aircraft. I don't care if it's commercial or defense. There's a zillion of them because they're role-based, they're requirement-based. And that reality is what we're trying to capture here. And so the way that I'm looking at it is, the existing system works. How can we map it into ontology? And like I said, that's why that paper created that bridge for me for provenance, because it's really provenance with all the annotation. And we look at it as every node in that workflow has a graph hanging off it, which is the BFO-based ontology. But the steps that you go through, because you make a decision, do I even have to go do loads for this? There's a zillion. It's vast when you look at a real design.
Yeah. This is
I just did a time check, and I want to ask, did we get through all the questions that people gave us?
Actually, no.
We had better spend some time on that. Are there any final thoughts about this thread?
I do have some final thoughts. So I just want to say that Iris, what you're saying is absolutely correct. And on the point of identity conditions for information, it's a very interesting philosophical topic, like whether you change a word or whatnot or miss a note, for sure. And what I think what Barry is pointing at is, those really aren't the sorts of questions that we have to have firm conditions or constraints on when we're doing the high level modeling. That doesn't mean there aren't firm constraints. They come from requirements, solicitation, competency questions and whatnot that come from the domain and they're on the ground, just in the way you're describing. And what we do is we take that and we try to find what's common, whatever words we use. Again, the words don't matter. We're not doing linguistics. We're trying to provide a common structure across all those sorts of cases so it's general, and then provide you the resources under which you can fit your various characterizations, whether it's this company or not, because ultimately we're trying to solve interoperability problems and see what's common across them, even if they have specific differences structurally on the ground.
That's why I came here, was to create all this trouble.
I love it. No, it's not trouble.
Yeah. Just one point, Stephen. I think you made a very good point, and that's what I was trying to say on Tuesday. So this 7.5 years of development. So we need to have a traceability. But when we address this problem and the example that I explained, the complexity is so big because we're trying to open that option to our engineers, that we try to focus on the decisions, and you said it as well. So which were the key decisions? And that's the thing that I want traceability from. The rest, maybe not, but at least that's the minimum. And how that's the
goal, right? If we can
yes.
use these tools,
Yes. Yes.
This is the most important thing.
Yes.
In the last 6 programs, let's spend more money there instead of over here.
Yes.
Yeah,
Exactly.
Exactly. Who made that decision? Yes. What was the rationale behind that decision? And then I can start testing.
I'm supposed to go through some questions. And is Miloš in the room? Yes. Okay. Hello, Miloš. So Miloš is the only person whose questions I have answers to. So we talked a lot about process profiles and process characteristics. This is a kind of summary in response to Milos. So process characteristic just means any adjectival phrase treated as if it represented something in reality. When you use an adjectival phrase in a true sentence about a process. And then a process profile is a change within a process along a certain axis, for instance, temperature or color or whatever it might be. And then with the relation between process characteristics and processes and processes and process profiles themselves, we're working on it, and you can see I think we're making some progress, but it's difficult territory. Now, where this all started was the following. There is a very important area where we have many important process characteristics which have a very important role in all kinds of engineering contexts. Namely, they are process characteristics which involve the idea of rate or rate of change. So they include things like velocity, acceleration, output rate, illness rate among the personnel, rate of fault detection in machines and so on. Rates are everywhere in the world of processes. And it makes sense that we should find a way of treating rates ontologically within a BFO consistent framework. We do not have that yet. I tried to convert, basically this is the differential calculus, but it's a differential calculus generalized to include things like rate of hamburger production by this kitchen in October. That's not really a mathematical question, but you need the differential calculus to understand any kind of rate. And I didn't succeed. So I have a degree in mathematics, but I did not succeed to get something which looked like useful ontology content. But I've not forgotten about this. And the introduction of the phrase process characteristic is a first step towards having the possibility of describing rates in a BFO framework. Now, we have participation. So I'll read Milos's question. Is participation the appropriate relation to indicate dependency of process profile on a particular material entity? The problem here goes back to the plant, which goes from being green to being brown. Is the color the thing which participates in that process profile? Or is it the plant? And our answer is, and this is part of BFO, it forces you to choose the answer. The answer is the plant. The plant is the participate in the process profile. Plant is the participant in the process profile because it's the participant in the process as a whole. And now, if you say, well, let's suppose we just take this leaf and consider its color change process profile, then it would be the leaf which is the participant. But it's still a material entity. It's still an object because that's what BFO says it has to be. And BFO here forces you to say certain things, which is good because it means we're all forced along the same lines, so we don't fall in all directions. But it's painful because that makes you think, which is painful for some people. All right. Is participation even the right relation? And then there are issues like processes of handover. This is my example. So can a process profile be such that there is a shift in participants along the way? And the example I came up with is when you have a factory, there is an output of that production which can be described using process profile terms. And now the crew changes from the morning to the afternoon. Can we then have a process profile which has the same process profile which has different participants in different times? I don't see why not, and this is an example where it seems that that would be the case. And now this is a really big question, and that means I don't have an answer. But I wrote one down. And John may disagree. John is on a phone call. So there are two worlds in which we live. There's one world which is the mathematically describable world, where processes have a first instant, meaning a zero length time interval, a time interval which has zero length, and a last instant. That's one world. And then there is the common sense world, where starting the race may take 4 seconds. But we don't know, we don't measure it. We know the race started, we know the race ended, so we don't really care precisely when it started and precisely where it ended. Same goes for death. So when the surgeon calls the time of death, they're creating a time of death which is fake, because no one knows exactly when the death occurred. So there are two worlds, the instantaneous respecting world and the vague starting ending world. BFO has to deal with both. I don't think it does very well yet, but it provides all you need, because it provides its time instant and time interval, which is what we're talking about here. Most of what we know about is time intervals. It's very rare that we really know about time instants, but it's very useful to have time instants for surgical cases where it may hand on whether he died on Wednesday or Tuesday, who inherits his fortune. I don't know. Instant. I've only been talking about instants in the last minute and a half. Exactly. All right, now, so what I say is all uses of first and last instant in the BFO sense are about zero length time regions. But most use of time specifications in the real world is vague. All right, now another big problem, and I really haven't been following IOF's treatment of plans. So can someone tell me, does IOF treat the plan as being identical to the plan specification, or the written version of the plan as a GDC? Or does it treat the plan as being something in the head of the manager? Okay, one of which is called plan specification. Okay, so a plan is a plan specification. Good, all right. Now we have the same problem between design and design specification. So I don't know. There are designers in the room, they should help me make this call. So in the same problem arose in the IOF core, and the decision was made not to care. In other words, we'll call it plan, and we mean either plan in the head of the manager or the plan as specified on paper. You should know about this because you have this idea in your head. Notice that I did not use the word concept, and neither did you, which is fantastic. But now, do you distinguish between the design and the design specification? Yeah.
First thought in my mind, right, was that to my mind, a design specification is something that is now actionable, right? So somebody can now execute on a design, right? Whereas a design in general could be executable or could not be, right?
So is this a bit like the difference between Tolstoy's manuscript and the actual published novel?
The original design may not be economically or viably or physically able to do today, and a new technique a month from now may make it viable to go back to the original design and come up with a different plan of how to implement it.
My guess is that we need to punt on this. We don't care. In general, we don't care. There'll be specific cases where we do care. You want to say something about this?
I mean, I was sort of going to say the same thing, but also, again, because it comes up a lot, despite the fact that I just said this. Words, we're not linguists. What does it mean? You tell us. We describe the common structure. Design versus design specification. Don't let your theoretical intuitions import over into a general structure. So
it's sometimes important to capture design or the thought.
Yeah.
Because this may not be economically viable to implement, but we're to be exported. And
fair.
in the software world, things are changing so fast that, you know, what's not viable today is definitely viable a month from now.
So I'd like to go to number 4 since we have very little time. So we've been talking about roles of designs for, so if it's actionable then. So that means that you are assigning a role to a GDC. Now, we don't have roles of GDCs in BFO. Only objects can have roles. And now, but you're against roles of GDCs, right?
I'm in favor.
Okay, so who is against?
I don't think anybody is against. It's just, you can, I mean, the line is no, I said I'm in favor. Yeah, I said I'm in favor. So the motivating case I see is like, if I'm talking about arguments, so God exists, therefore God exists, what's the difference between what's going on? The same content, the premise and conclusion, they occupy different roles in an argument context. Like that's a good case to me. But like the opponents, I think the only opposition I've seen is not opposition to GDCs having roles. It's more that you can say that in BFO without having GDCs bear roles. And so everything I just said about that context, you could specify in terms of the inputs and outputs of processes of like inferring or asserting. And so you can spell out the different places that.
So in other words, you are against it because you think we don't need it.
No, I'm not against it. David is against it.
David Limbaugh. What's his reason?
That's why he said you can reduce
we don't
it
need
away.
it.
Yeah, you can reduce it away basically, and I, you know.
So some people criticize BFO because it moves slowly, and officially we just didn't have this conversation. But so officially BFO doesn't allow GDCs to have roles. Maybe we will change that, but we're at a stage or a level where there are so many people involved with their peccadillos and their urgent needs and their government mandates and so forth that we really have to work things through with different audiences until we reach the point where we find workable solutions which will do justice to at least many of our stakeholders.
And so we need to wrap up because we're cutting into the break and then we have to start another session at 11:20.
Okay.
But let's.
All right, so I'm going to continue where we left off. Anyone who doesn't want to stay in the room can leave, but people shouldn't have conversations too loud while I'm trying to do this. So I'll pick up where John left off. That concerns the contents in the slides. And this just repeats what he says, but it gives it in a more visual way. So Arco should like it. Arco's still here? Okay, never mind. So let me, yeah, so can you all hear me? So the idea is that when we're dealing with things like molecules or people, we know that they change qualities. And so we need to have words or terms in our ontology to represent those qualities. But now processes do not change. So when we're dealing with objects, we can think of ourselves as being in a world which we are looking at objects, they survive, they endure through time. But when we're dealing with processes, we can't do that because we only ever see an instantaneous tiny slice of a process. And so what we need to do is to become God. And then we look down at the process world from a God's eye perspective, and then all processes are already there in their full extent. Now we think that they're changing, but in fact, God knows that I was already going to do this with my hands from the very beginning of my beginning to talk. From the God's eye perspective, the process is always there. It doesn't change. If I decide to do something else with my hands, nothing has changed because God knows that I would put my hands behind my back at this very moment. So that's the workable way of dealing with ontology, with objects and processes in the same ontology. We have to imagine two worldviews. One is, we used to call it the snap worldview because we take pictures. then the span worldview, where we look at whole videos. All right, so that means that we don't need any extra entities called qualities, but we need to talk about processes as speeding up or slowing down or being interrupted or being repeated. And so we have introduced the facility to talk about processes in those sorts of terms by introducing the term characteristic, which is just an analog of quality in the process world, but which in fact is merely an abbreviation for a much more complicated story, which might be a differential calculus kind of story about rates. And then there are no instances of these process characteristics. There are instances of qualities, always, but it doesn't make sense to say that process characteristics exist, because talk of process characteristics is merely an abbreviation for talking about processes and process profiles. All right, so another way of putting this is characteristics are defined classes. Now, there are many areas within an ontology like BFO where we need to introduce abbreviations. So an example would be the term pet, which is an abbreviation for either a dog or a cat or a fish or a cockatoo or a piece of stone or anything that you treat as a pet. There is no universal pet. It's an abbreviation of a long disjunctive list beginning with cat, dog, cockatoo, and so on. But it's useful to have this abbreviation. And there are many other abbreviations that we need to use in tandem with BFO. And because they're abbreviations, they're a matter of language. They don't belong in the hierarchy. They're neither continuance nor occurrence, because they're not anything. They're just ways of talking. All right, and now we need to give people guidance when they're dealing with a real universal or whether they're dealing with a defined class. And I don't have that full guidance here. Both defined classes and universals have definitions. So the terminology of defined classes is somewhat confusing, but people have got used to it. We're not going to eliminate it now. It's not an official part of BFO. It's a part of BFO implementation strategy, namely, use abbreviations when you need them. All right, now, defined classes are different from universals, which are classes in the strict sense. One subtype of universal we discussed this morning, they are the types which Dusan invents in his laboratory and hopes that he will have instances one day. They are genuine universals already today, providing Dusan has a relevant power and so on, and resources and everything. Now, every genuine class must be reachable from the root of the ontology by a process of single inheritance is-are relations. Pet is not reachable because there are several roots. So there are fish, which goes through, I don't know, what's the next thing in the tree of life? Swimming thing. The fish, and then there's cat. Cat is a subtype of mammal. Fish is not a subtype of mammal. And so there is no single, unique, continuous path from pet to object, although all pets are objects. Ali. So there are all kinds of ways of treating things. It's not a problem. It's nice to have the defined class pet, that people like pets. There are pet shops. Anyway. Now, we talked about this. We'll call it the no sudden death criterion, although I'm not fixed on that terminology. So dog is a universal, child is not a universal because something can cease to be a child without ceasing to exist. The same goes for human versus manager and so forth. Now, one important stepping stone in the development of ontologies since the millennium is the idea, which was invented by Aristotle, that when you're building definitions of terms in an ontology, you should use what are called Aristotelian or two-part definitions. So an example would be a human is a rational animal. Every human is an animal which is rational. All your definitions of terms should look like that. They have two parts. The second part can be rather complicated. It can have multiple constituent phrases, but the basic idea is you use B as A which sees. And if you do that, then you guarantee single inheritance in the sense that if you don't have single inheritance, you won't know which route upwards to follow. So we may have a car, which is a blue car, which is also a Ford Pinto. What is the parent that's relevant for car? Well, you might like that it's a blue car. You don't even know that it's a Ford Pinto. But the only route up the tree which adheres to the no sudden death principle is the Ford Pinto car, because you can repaint your car, and then it becomes a red car, but it doesn't thereby cease to exist. So the no sudden death principle guides you in problematic cases. And another case which is famous in the history of medical ontology is meningitis. A meningitis is an infectious disease. A meningitis is a disease of the meninges. Both of those are perfectly good terms in a medical ontology. So which is the parent of meningitis? How many people think that infectious disease is an appropriate term, parent? How many people think that disease of the meningitis is an appropriate parent? You're all really unthinking louts. Now I want volunteers at least. John, you know everything. What?
I'll go with infectious.
No, you're both wrong.
Infectious disease for 100.
So you can, there is a way of turning meningitis into a non-infectious disease. The meningitis doesn't go away, but its infectious character doesn't go away. You can't turn a meningitis into a disease of the earlobe. So it's essentially a disease of the meninges. So you get special points for being brave. And then I delete most of those points because you got the wrong answer. No, I wanted a parent. Yeah, that's fine. That's fine. But that wouldn't be its parent in the ontology. No. All right. I'll give you 3/4.
I mean, by that logic, I mean, in a world in which people are all, well, I don't want to say vaccinated, but technically, like, we're all immune to meningitis. Would that just, therefore, meningitis disease should not be a disease in that world?
No, in that world, there is meningitis which is non-infectious. There are medical processes that you can apply in some cases of meningitis which remove the infectious character. You still have the meningitis, but it's no longer.
At the same time,
infectious.
it would not be a disease anymore in that
world.
Of
course, in that world, there are all kinds of other things wrong with meningitis other than it's being infectious. You don't want to have meningitis.
Oh, of course. But what I'm saying is that you can also imagine a world in which every single human being is immune to it, or every living being is immune to it. So therefore, it's just then it's not a disease at that point.
So that's an interesting.
Sure.
Yeah.
No, I know, but at the same time, I'm saying you can question the fact that it's infectious. I'm just saying you can also question the fact that it's a disease.
Okay, good. So under
how much change do we want in order to change the definition?
We have the law that if you have one instance or had one instance or prospectively in Dusan's world will have an instance, then it's a universal, or rather every universal has had or prospectively will have an instance. So meningitis, if meningitis existed in the world at any time, then it's a disease at every time because it's a universal and it's a child of the universal disease. So if it goes away because we have really strong AI that can cure cancer and make you immortal, which we will have before long,
Well,
David Chalmers.
Okay, you're saying that it's infectious only because we can pass it to one another, right?
No, no.
Well, I'm also,
No,
what is it?
that's not right. So certain pathogens are infectious because of their dispositions to be transmitted as part of their life cycle, like a virus.
Yeah,
So
yeah, yeah,
That's not about
Okay.
you. You can be inoculated or whatnot, or be vaccinated, but this is not about
Still
you.
an infectious disease.
Still infectious disease. Well, it's an infectious pathogen, and that may manifest an infectious disease if you have the appropriate like abnormalities, if it had been transmitted. But if it's not, still the thing that parasite, that pathogen itself is infectious. It just can't get through you.
All right.
Okay.
So now, how do we deal with defined classes when we're doing ontology building using Protégé, for instance? Well, the answer is that you don't. In your asserted version of the ontology, the version that you keep close to your heart. And Protégé gives you the two views. On the one hand, there is the asserted version, the editor's version, the version that wears the trousers. And then you have the inferred version. And the inferred version is what you get when you add the definitions of your defined classes. You suddenly have multiple parentage, you have more spaghetti, probably bring down Arco's tramp plant thing. But that you can still find that useful. People find multiple inheritance very often, for instance, when dealing with meningitis, useful because you don't want to forget that it's an infectious disease. So that's how you deal with this problem if you're using Protégé. You keep your asserted classes close to your heart, and you use the defined classes for the sake of convenience. And now that I wrote this paper a long time ago on process profiles, and it was part of my effort to work out how to deal with rate data. So I spent years trying to find a way of dealing with rate data in a world in which processes do not change. So we have a process of running, which is P. And now the first problem is that P is going to be an instance of multiple universals, one way or another. So it's going to be a running process. It's going to be a fast running process. It's going to be a running process with a certain duration. It's going to be a running process which involves motion. It's going to involve displacement in space. It's going to use up energy. It's going to use up oxygen and so on. Now, all of those are facts about the running process. And a good example is of the kind of problem that we face now is the spinning top. So when you spin a spinning top, you initiate two processes. One is a spinning process, but the spinning top gradually gets warmer. It's a heating process. So we have a process of increasing temperature, and we have a process of spinning, and they occupy exactly the same region of space-time, exactly. And so we need a way of dealing with that. And this was the birth of the idea of process profiles. What we have here is a spinning process profile and a warming profile, and they both exist in the same space and the same time with the same participant. And that's what we have here. So we have measuring devices which tell us that this particular running process has these and these characteristics. And that's because there are these 4 process profiles and many more process profiles. And so then this is where we get some kind of relevance to engineering. In an engineering context, we're dealing with multiple measurable process profiles. And we just think we're dealing with processes. And that's true because every process profile is a process, but a process profile is usually measurable. Sometimes it's not. The red-brown plant process profile is not measurable so directly, but most of the process profiles that will matter in engineering are going to be measurable ones. All right, so what does a temperature chart represent? So it doesn't represent the molecules moving around in Ringo when he gets warmer. It measures the temperature. which is a certain measurable feature. The change in temperature then is a process profile, a temperature process profile, or a quality process profile geared to the quality of temperature. And then we get vibration level. So this is an engineering example. So the vibration level changes over time, and you can graph it. The vibration level in an engine or a machine is something which is a process profile candidate in virtue of the fact that we can measure it, we can assign likelihoods to it and so forth. The Dow Jones Industrial Average represents a process profile. So this diagram represents what happened here. Now, what happened here is much, much more complicated than what we would think if we just look here. But this is, in fact, a very useful representation of a process profile which captures what is important from some perspectives about what's going on in here. Now, there are other things going on here which would be important to some people. But for most people, it's that which is important. So again, it's a measurable slice through a complex process. And now every time series graph is a representation of a process profile.
So I had one question.
Yeah.
Would the environment requirements be part of the process profile? Like if there's no gravity, your spinning top doesn't work. If there's no oxygen available for it to operate on, does that become part of the profile or outside?
So there is a sense in which when we start doing process profile related work, we are dislocating it ourselves from questions of causality, environment, finickiness of the relevant day, the weather. We're only interested in this slice of reality, which is Ringo's temperature or the Dow Jones yesterday, or we're not interested in anything else. Now, if you start doing ontology about process profiles, then you might very well be interested in the environment. So what happened at that time, which made the Dow crash by all those dollars, I suppose. And then you need to go out into the environment. But the process profile itself lives in process profile land, which is a very slim, deliberately a very slim impression created by the world when we impose measurement. And this creates a whole series of philosophical questions. And I hate philosophical questions, but I've got this far, I will continue. Plato talks about a slave boy, and he got a slave boy to prove Pythagoras' theorem by means of making lines in the sand with a stick. So he drew a triangle, basically. And then Plato's question, this is a philosophical question now, did the triangle which the boy drew in the sand exist before he drew it, or did he create it? That's a philosophical question. There's no answer. Now, did we create the temperature process profile class? These are classes, they're universals. When we invented temperature measurements, or were there corresponding changes in Ringo's temperature, which we can now represent in a graph before we created the unit of measure or the units of measure? And it's a philosophical question. There is no answer to it, but it's a good question to have in the back of your mind because it makes you think about the nature of units of measure and so forth. Now, of course, with the Dow Jones Industrial Average, did that exist before Dow and Jones sat down and did some thinking? In one sense, no, because they created this work of art, in a sense. But in another sense, yes, because the stock exchange existed and it was doing all of those things. And you can calculate retrospectively the Dow Jones Average on every day that the stock exchange existed, I assume. Well, anyway, I'm guessing. Yes.
I do have a question. So let's take Dow Jones example. Process is stock market trading, right?
Yeah.
And you have measurements of this
Yeah.
chart that you showed.
Yeah.
And this is process profile of that trading process.
Yeah.
So are you talking about two processes, since process profile is subclass of process? Are you talking about two processes or one process?
So the Dow Jones Industrial Average process profile is one process within a much richer and complicated process, which includes lots and lots of people buying and selling and reporting and gossiping and all the other things they do to influence the changes in the stock market. The big, fat, ugly, full
So process profile is measurement of some process.
Measurement-focused views on complicated processes.
So, but two processes exist.
At least the full process exists and the process profile exists. A lot of typing, a lot of sending signals wirelessly. All right, now, I said earlier that generically dependent continuance includes some of the most important things in reality, like poems and symphonies and works of literature and Dow Jones Industrial Average and so forth. So that the movements of the Dow Jones Industrial Average are a process profile, but the Dow Jones Industrial Average itself is a creation, and like writing a novel, creation on multiple levels. All speech is like that. So if you measure what's going on when we speak, you have acoustic signals, you have neurological activities in people's brains, you have then the signals themselves, which are measured acoustically. All of these lines in these the two graphs are representations of process profiles. And then if you add the speech itself, then that is another process profile within this big, fat, ugly process, which is called a human being speaking, which involves me spitting out and my lungs, pushing air through my mouth, my diaphragm, pushing air through my lung, diaphragm, pushing air through my lungs, arms waving all the time. So speech is a process profile. And that's what it says here. And conscious mental processes, so having ideas about aerospace manufacture, that is a process profile, which is dependent on all kinds of changes in your brain primarily. All right, so this is, it's an intuitive definition. We can do better than this, I believe, but we don't want to commit to anything better until we've worked out what we should commit to. That takes a lot of arguing. So one of the reasons why BFO is the way that it is because we have quite a number of argumentative philosophers who just like arguing. And so we have to find out how to keep them quiet. So you can look at that. It's basically repeating what I just said. Yes? Yeah. Well, you can slice up the process profile into temporal bits. That would be a proper current part. If you want a proper continuant part, so I guess we can do this. I'll cheat for a minute. So all the parts of Ringo's temperature process profile when Ringo's temperature was greater than 30 degrees Celsius or something. That would give you a gappy process profile. Is what? Yeah, I know, but we could say that the gaps are part of the process profile, as long as it's starting and ending point. This is one of the areas where we have not.
If every process profile is a process, and a process must have parts, what are the parts of the process profile?
Well, we say processes must have temporal parts. I don't believe that we say processes must have. What's the word?
I think it's proper a current part.
So a current part, so temporal parts are slices in time. Current parts, I think, are parts which can be extended in time. So let's suppose we have the process profile of, I think that we do not claim that every process must have a proper current part. We say that every process has proper temporal parts because we want to distinguish between a process which is extended and a process boundary, which is the beginning or the ending of a process. But I don't believe that we say that every process
Okay, I'll
must
double
have-
check. I've got it in.
Double check, yeah. Means I don't quite know if this is right or if this is this. I'm not perfect, so sometimes I wave my hands. I never use sneer quotes, but Todd isn't here now, so that's it. All right. So now, how does BFO deal with rate data? Now we come to Milos's question.
Oh, I do have an answer real quick.
So I think I did this morning, didn't I? Yeah.
Yes, I do have
So-
an answer. I just looked it up. Process, and I don't know if this is coming from BFO or from the core, but every process has a current part. Oh, it's only. Aha, it's an
okay.
only. Okay, all right.
All right, good. Sorry, can you start again, Milos? Yeah. Yeah. And that's what Jim did. All right. I need to do this more often so that I have the response more quickly in my mind. So let me try again with the answer to Milos 1.2. So every process, every complicated process, every interesting process which we're likely to be measuring is going to have process profiles. Many process, we very often want to talk about those process profiles. We want to say that Ringo's temperature is increasing. When we say that, what makes what we say true, the process profile, and also the process which the process profile is contained in, but that's redundant. So the process profile is enough to make it true. The Ringo's temperature is increasing. That is a characteristic, the increasingness. That it is increasing. So Ringo's temperature is increasing, or Ringo's temperature increased yesterday. These are uses of the term process characteristic, which are convenient abbreviations for references to the corresponding process profile. Many characteristics will be like that. Not all, but many. So the zigzag process, interrupted process, repeated process, these are all relying on something like the process. Yes. So no, I think that they will have numerical measurements. For instance, we might want to say that John was running with a constant velocity of 11 feet per second. Actually, he only has 2 feet. If he was a centipede. So I don't see any harm in having numbers in process characteristics.
So, of course, like, say, when you say this is characterizing of the profile, but then say my speed profile is such that I can say that I drove in a moderate speed or something.
Yeah.
But then the moderate speed numerically probably considered as 50 mph.
Yes.
But I want to say that, I am driving in a moderate speed because my average speed is 60 mph.
So BFO is there in order to create interoperability between different bodies of empirical data. The police is following you when you're driving over the speed limit or when you're driving too slowly, and thereby creating data. We should concentrate on that kind of starting point, not on, I'm driving at a moderate speed, because that's not empirical data. In other words, let me try this again. The reason why it makes sense to talk about the God's eye view when dealing with processes is because when we're dealing with processes in a database, the data is always retrospective. We don't, this is probably false empirically, but we don't have data which is about what's happening when we're collecting the data. There's always some kind of temporal gap there.
Or like trying to find a relationship between the profile and the characteristics.
Yeah, and
so I'm saying that average speed 60, but the average speed itself is a profile because that can change. I can plot the average speed. So that can be also
you could
profile.
have an average speed process profile. You have to define it mathematically, but you could have that.
Exactly.
But hang on a second.
Yeah,
if
sorry.
it doesn't matter, if the important thing is how labored the engine is, and that's the thing you're measuring, like how many RPMs, the speed doesn't matter. Like you're being efficient, you're going to get as much distance out of it. So measuring something as moderate or average speed when it doesn't matter doesn't mean anything. What might be important is the RPM on the engine.
No, yes. Okay. That's an example.
Yeah, but there's a lot of things that we don't measure because we don't consider them a profile, and we collect a lot of data that we don't understand whether it's going to be a future profile, and so
whether it's going to be in the future a useful profile.
It might be,
Yeah,
right?
and that's why we should keep the data.
And that's the discussion. Yes.
Yeah.
So just as a clarification, would you consider the numerical aspect of process profiles, or sorry, process characteristics, would that be part of that, like that part of the process characteristic itself, or would you consider it as a measurement information content entity?
Yeah, so you're pushing me down a road which I don't want to go down.
Come on, Barry. That's why we're here.
So what the road goes like this. So we have a universal quality of being of length, all right, which is measured in inches or centimeters or whatever. It doesn't matter. So we have a term in a length ontology or a measurement ontology, which will be in this case it will be a term representing a child of length, and that would be a child of quality. Do we now have a child of length, which is called 1 inch length, or 1.1 inch length, or 1.11 inch length? We don't want to go down that road. So you should not push me down that road, because otherwise you will fall in my...
Well, I mean, I would say that since, you know, at some point we want to consider things like relative qualities, we don't want to have that the way you described it. We want it to be measurements.
So these are real qualities which exist in reality and which could be
of course, length exists, but there's also the measurement I see.
So just as a matter of anecdotal interest, are you familiar with the catastrophe in the Airbus wiring, which caused 6 billion? I'm talking to you, Mr. Boeing. You are aware of that. That was a case where millimeters of difference in length of cables cost $6 billion to rectify. So these qualities, millimeter size length differences, are very important. And the confusion came about because of two distinct ontologies of whole in the French and the German engineering information bodies. So one of them thought that holes were 2D objects, holes that cables go through. And the other one thought that holes were 3D objects because they measured, I don't know, they saw the hole as being contained within a piece of metal or plastic, which would then have a length. And they miscalculated. So they couldn't put the two parts of the Airbus together when they brought them from Hamburg to Toulouse. So anyway, these are important questions, but I don't want to go down that road. And I may say today. All right. Now, Milos again. So I think I did address this morning. And I addressed the shift in participants. I'm not happy with the crew handover.
Actually, technically, they're not supposed to be in this room. This survey provider.
She said they're not supposed to be in this room. So are you going to give up? Do you want to give up our room?
So we can't really hear you very clearly. Another conversation. Okay. All right. So let me move on. Yeah. Yeah. Good. Good. All right. So we have this hierarchy: quality, color, red, maybe dark red on the next level, maybe red RGB 93, 22, 41 on the next level down. So we're only interested in the first two or three levels for this purpose. The plant is, and actually we're dealing with green. The plant is green at time t. The plant is brown at time t prime. The plant has a color, and the color quality is identical from t to t prime because it's identical through the whole existence of the plant. It always has its color. But now this color is sometimes a green color, and then at later times it's a brown color. So even though it always has its color, it always has its quality, it can change the hue or the shade of color from one time to the next. Now this means that when you say what is your temperature, what you mean is what is the measurement value of your temperature. But a correct answer to that question would be it's the same temperature as yesterday, even though it's higher today. It's still the same temperature because I only have one temperature, just as I only have one shape, even though my shape is changing, my size is changing, and so on. So this is the way BFO thinks about qualities. And
how do you connect?
Yeah.
How do you connect that with process profile?
Yeah.
That says that.
Yeah. So
could the speaker get a
yeah,
microphone?
so someone speaking?
Yeah, that's.
All right, so I really don't understand this question because to me it seems obvious. If we focus on the color of the plant, we're focusing on instances, and we're interested in the color quality of the plant, which exists as it exists at time t1, and the color quality of the plant as it exists at time t2. And then conceivably, we're interested in the continuous changes between those times. We can see the instances before.
Yeah, that's not part of the question. The question is, how do you tie the process profile that says that this process profile is about that color?
No, the process profile is made up of those color qualities. It's not about them. It's a thing in the world.
Well, okay, so a process profile has a participant, which is the rose.
Yep.
How do I say the rose's color is in this process profile? The rose's color was red.
Yeah, so I said earlier that when you start talking about process profiles, you are disengaging yourself from the messy world of what happens and is the case and causality. You're just looking at this particular sliver of being, which is measurable or detectable. And in this case, the sliver is these colors. You see them, and you see over time.
How do I know that it's about the color and not the mass?
Because you're an intelligent human being.
Well, we're interpreting it what, by the name of the process profile?
So you're steeped in BFO. You know how to recognize qualities. You also know how to recognize colors because you're a human being. You'd be dead if you didn't have that capacity. You wouldn't know where to look for the milk and so forth.
I think what Jim is asking is whether we would have a specific process profile of the change of color. Like,
okay, so now
that's what you're
I
wondering.
mentioned this as an issue earlier.
And how do you connect it to the color of this rose?
Yeah, good.
I think I have a way for that.
So I think that measurement units and measurement processes are cultural achievements of human beings. We have them we have had them for a long time. Roughly about the time of Napoleon, we managed to have uniform ones over the whole planet. We still have problems with comparing Celsius and Kelvin degrees and so on. Even that is not quite sorted out by the metrology world, but we've seen the way forward to make those problems disappear. Now, and we're now back to Plato with his stick in the sand. When those units of measure systems came into existence, did the world change? Or did we just now have a way of grasping the features of the world, which is more precise and communicable and so forth? I lean towards the second answer. And now you seem to be worried. I think colors are out there, and that we can see them and recognize them as colors. And when we see something change in color, then we are recognizing a process profile. So what's your issue?
So my issue is, shouldn't there be some sort of a relation between a particular process profile and the particular color of the rose that is the participant in that process profile?
Yeah.
How do I point at at that particular color instead of the particular mass?
Yeah. So
when you say we're intelligent people, but it seems like we're missing a relation.
Somebody tells you to measure the height of your brother. You don't worry, or do I need to measure the height, or does he want the length or the temperature? You just know what height means. I don't understand the question. Anyone else think he has a question here? No? So I've said that most process profiles are measurement process profiles, but there are also quality process profiles as regards, for instance, color. I think process profiles in the realm of measurement are the most useful ones, but there are process profiles in other realms. And if I'm right, thinking is a process profile. Conscious thinking is a series of events which make a process. And it's a process profile because part of your consciousness is not the circulation of blood through your brain, but your consciousness is somehow part of a system which involves circulation of blood in the brain. Yeah, so that you can extend measurement to include things like color.
Yes, let me try with this. So yes, we as humans can understand surely from the label or in one way or another what is meant. But if you have several thousand things in your database, how do you actually structurally, what is the pattern?
You go to your catalog of devices and you look up color sensor, and then you go to the color sensor and you put it in front of the flower and switch it on. And then you get a very good measurement of a process profile.
So you're saying that through using the measurement instruments and measurements, we do not need a direct connection between a process profile and the quality it's related to.
It comes free with the label on the sensor.
I think that you are suggesting that we create a taxonomy of the different types of profile, just like we have a taxonomy of quality. Right?
Yes, exactly, just like that.
Yeah. So there will be a speed process profile, there will be a color process profile. The color process profile is different from the quality color, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So, all right, so let me try one more time.
Right? Like we do not have any correspondence. They are like separate thing, and you understand it like, oh, color means color of an object, and color process profile means color of a process profile. That's all.
A body of gas can have a color. Yeah. Doesn't have to be an object. So I really don't understand your problem. So you lose. You lose.
So I will say that the answer is actually IOF. IOF needs to actually make classes or taxonomy. So you have an IRI for color process profile, and all the companies need to use color process profile, IOF color process profile, whenever they are talking about color change.
Yeah, that would probably be helpful because they would have consistent.
That's the correspondence that I was talking about, yeah.
Yeah, so human beings have to be involved. How much time do we have?
We have negative time now. It's
Okay.
actually time for lunch.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Barry.